Before you
Oh, just started recording. Cool.
Let's do it.
Awesome. So thanks for coming, y'all. I think CJ is kind of the informal MC for this, but if anyone has questions or anything, hop in at any point. Yeah. Cool. So let me just check out this initial commit here. So for reference here, I've got the commit log here. And then I can kind of look at the code on this side. So the initial version was, there's a bunch of crap in here because Git didn't remove it, but it was basically, I think I have a index.org file, not even pages. Did that work? Check that out. Oh, local changes would be overwritten. Let's stash those real quick. Do that again. Okay. There we go. Yeah, so I was big, when I first started making this website, I was really into org mode. For those of you who don't know what org mode is, it's this markup language plus Emacs major mode, which means it's got a whole bunch of features for doing things roughly related to organization, note-taking, agenda type stuff, to-dos, but it's also got these really interesting features that let you embed code. But the first version of this is basically just this bash script, which I probably could not write today. I kind of iteratively put together, and I very rarely do anything with bash, but it basically, for every folder in the root, go into that folder, look at the file. If it's a file and it's not named README and it ends with .org, make a folder, or wait, I don't know, but eventually use Pandoc, which is a really impressive Haskell program that can kind of turn almost any document format into almost any other document format, to turn the whole thing into HTML. Use this little Lua script to change all the internal links from .org to .html so that it works, and then dump it into a folder. So if I down here do a little .build.sh, and it doesn't work because of what I was saying earlier with the first commit not actually working. So let me check out that commit. And now it works. There's an extra org file in there. That's my new inbox file that Git's not tracking. It takes a kind of ridiculously long time to build for some reason. But and so now let's just cd public simple web server. Yeah, and so it generates a site that looks kind of like this, which basically just consists of showing off the bash script that made the site. And that's included with this little include here. So it's dynamically interspersed.
What got you to use org mode initially? Because I know that's sometimes a big decision of what am I going to build my website with.
I was taking a lot of notes with org mode anyway.
Okay.
I don't know if I continue to take a lot of notes with org mode today. So, but I don't know if I'd quite peaked that much, but really it's just kind of it's a very ergonomic inside Emacs, which is kind of the only place org mode exists. It's not like a very broadly available thing outside. It is a very nice workflow. Creating nodes and manipulating them is really easy. So you can kind of move these nodes around for note-taking and stuff like that. And so the idea was, I guess, even now I have this premise where I kind of want my notes to turn into my site. And so that was kind of the same thing I was going for then. Yeah, and exciting thing for me was how small everything was, where like I could, with this entire thing, let's see, like if I made another, create a file here called like blog.org, give it a title, a blog post, and kind of put anything in here, and then go back into the inbox, or no, the index folder, drop in just like put that link in there in the middle of the whole thing. And then if I rebuild the thing, the thing would, basically it's just this very fast post-creation workflow. And I think later on I kind of did that. And so this was kind of like the starting point of the whole thing. I wish I had proper dates over here so I could kind of see where that was going on, but that was where it started. And now let's see, maybe let's check out where it gets a little more interesting. Couple commits ahead, where I got excited about doing a blog and a whole load of org babble. So check that out. And so here, I basically, instead of having a bash script, though I still do, I have these scripts embedded directly inside the org file using this feature called org babble, which lets you intersperse org files with code from arbitrary languages. And so in this case, I have an eLisp block here, and this kind of looks for this particular file I'm working with, executes the buffer. So it executes every script inside here and then saves the output. And then here I have a bash script that is looking through the blog folder and basically taking the first 3 items from it. So said basically I generate the index for the blog page, and then here I take the first lines from that generated index and dump them in this folder. So if I run this, oh, nope. I forget how to run this thing. E? Anyway, basically in Emacs, there's a keyboard shortcut that I evidently haven't used in 2 years, but that would run that script and append the index for the blog post right there. And so I had in here, this is the similar bash script that's just generating. So basically I just tore apart the bash script I had previously and put it inside different parts of this Emacs folder, which in retrospect is not necessarily a recipe for maintainability, I guess, but that wasn't too much my concern. I was more interested in like how fun it was to put the whole thing together. And it was a lot of fun because though I don't know how far I eventually took this, I think somewhere around like, yeah, there's this big switch to Next.js here. This point was kind of like, in my mind, infinitely extendable. I could have, org mode posts with arbitrary bash scripts in them that were fetching like, my tweets and then dumping them into a file or doing whatever. And so this ends up looking kind of like this, which almost the same, except we have these code blocks in here, a more page that leads to just the code for each. This was kind of similar to the like view source functionality, except the idea was that like the source code for generating a particular page on the website was part of that particular page. And so if we go in here, So you can kind of see in here what was meant to happen, where you evaluate the code block and then the results just kind of pop up. I think I don't know if I still have this post live on my site somewhere. It might have gotten lost to the various rewrites.
So you were saying that you went from this, I guess, as you described it, a blog into a standard like Next.js, like, I guess JavaScript framework blog. What was that transition like? Because you said there was a time when then you just went to that. So
yeah, I mean, so this is the commit over here, and so it was like a pretty substantial thing. I'm pretty sure I used Pandoc to transfer all of the org mode files just to Markdown. And then in Next.js, I'm using Next plus this kind of great, kind of janky thing called MDX, which is a thing that basically takes Markdown files with JSX blocks inserted throughout them. JSX being like HTML-esque syntax for doing component things in JavaScript, for people who haven't done that, and turns it into a compliant JavaScript file that can be imported by other JavaScript pages. And so all Markdown is valid MDX, and so I converted all the org files to Markdown files, and then set up the MDX parser. And so it was a pretty substantial commit where everything kind of got axed and then added to a different place, maybe rewritten a bit. And I got rid of all the like Lua and Bash, and it turned into, because all the complexity is hidden by the JavaScript framework, it looks like a lot less code. But I think you can kind of, the 6,500 lines in package lock.json of the various packages that are being used kind of belies the hidden complexity here. I think the motivation was just I was doing a lot of JavaScript for like my work and was slowly growing more and more fond of it. I had recently rebuilt the Fathom website in this framework called Next.js, and it seemed like it worked well for a blog. Let me actually check out this commit, and then I can dig through it. Yeah, and it kind of worked well, except there were a whole bunch of hacks in place to get things like, Next is this hybrid between a static site generator and a server-side React rendering framework. So one of the main problems with making large single-page websites in JavaScript is you have to like dump a big bundle on the client that then they use to generate your whole thing. And if the client's just pulling down HTML, they are greeted with a blank page until this massive bundle runs and saturates your web page with whatever's going to be on there doing the React runtime. And so doing React with server-side rendering gets away from that, because they send a request to the server runs your big JavaScript bundle, and then sends back just the HTML that they need, along with all the requisite JavaScript to make the thing work. The downside there is that every time they switch to a different page, they have to pull down that whole thing again from the client. So Next had this, I think now fairly standard idea of like basically making a runtime around React that the first time the client makes a request will do that whole thing, send it to the server sends back the HTML plus the JavaScript. But every other time they make a transition to a different page, we'll do everything client side. So you get these fast client side transitions, plus the quick initial load, plus the SEO stuff. And I really wasn't interested in any of that. I've only like learned it after the fact. But the fun part to me was Next has this very tiny API surface where they've done a really great job of hiding the vast amount of that complexity, not in a way that like will come back to bite you in the ass, but in a way that you genuinely most of the time don't have to think about. So all the configuration we've got going on here is this Next.js there's this config file, so like 12 lines of configuration, and then everything else is basically just dropping markdown files inside here. And all of these kind of work as you would expect. You have this one special-ish file which defines how each of those markdown things is going to get turned into a eventually HTML document. Let's see if I can build this. Let's install node modules while I'm jumping around here. And so I can define just the components for my website really simply just with, this is React for those of you who haven't seen it, but I can kind of like have all these little things in here where it just kind of wraps the whole thing in this main layout. I can style it with CSS. This is using a CSS in JavaScript library called styled components, which some people find like a little blasphemous, but it's very convenient to write because you don't have to hop between like 3 different files to define your CSS in one place, your layouts in the other, anything like that. And then, yeah, so let's see. And now if I just do npm run dev, nope. Oh, I'm running a server somewhere else. That's not me. Some out-of-date packages. Okay. Yeah, and this I think is actually pretty close to what my current site looks like, but is pretty minimal. So yeah, the premise here was I think just more to learn Next.js and setting things up with the React than to do anything too interesting with the layout. I also didn't know any CSS or kind of much. I don't think I knew how to make a website more complicated than this at that point. So this was all I had going. I was very into green, and yeah, the premise here at this point was kind of like to use the blog as a documentation place, because I'd found myself kind of setting up a Linux laptop for the first time in a while and was kind of Googling the same things I Googled way before. And so I was like, I'll write it down this time. And I've referenced back to this blog post like 5 or 6 times since. So that definitely paid off a whole bunch.
So it's kind of using your original use case for org mode of, notes, of like personal notes, and just using it in a completely different framework.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
It's a nice like hack to like shift your brain away from like whether you have something worth writing or not, to just be like, oh, I'm probably going to need this later. It's just a note for me. And then over time, get your notes better and better. I don't know if everyone here's seen the Andy Matuszak's evergreen notes idea, but I've only recently come across it.
I just saw it yesterday.
Yeah, I've only recently come across the idea, but let's just, yeah. Oh, it's .org. This idea of like evergreen notes as notes that you can kind of grow into really polished pieces of writing and insight over time, I think is the overarching blog philosophy I'm at least working towards, if not actively at. Yeah, so evergreen notes are written to organize, evolve, contribute, accumulate over time. This whole thing is a pretty neat little setup that he is explicitly not sharing at this point in time because of premature scaling can stunt system iteration. And he will tell you exactly why.
If you want something similar that I think is open source, I think there's smallest federated wiki is something that does something similar to this, where if you're talking about that kind of tile format, but it's these notes that you can constantly develop and reference inside other notes. Yeah, but this is really, really cool.
Yeah, he's got it really polished. One of the nice things is this backlinks setup where you can kind of like, see that whole web. That's a thing I have wanted to implement for my site for a long time, but I want while writing notes, not while they're published. right? I want to be able to see the backlinks while I'm working on things. But yeah, anyway, I was working with Next and MDX, and so built this version of the site. And then if we hop a little bit ahead in time, see. There's a commit I'm looking for in here where I tried to do something where I would basically parse through the Git history using some Next.js or using a Next.js feature to run some JavaScript that parses through my Git history to pull out things like my writing statistics, like how many words I wrote over time, and make that visible. But I can't find the commit. Yeah, it's somewhere in here.
While you're looking for that, what interested you in trying to quantify your own note taking?
Not entirely sure. I'm not necessarily like, I wouldn't be like driven to write more to get that number to go higher. It was just kind of interesting. It was more a thing where I realized I could do it, I think, and then kind of just started doing it. Over here, there's this commit, which I was using this hack in order to generate index pages at compile time instead of at build time, because it needs to run both on the server and on the client, doesn't have a like view of every file you're working with. And so if you want to do things that depend on like something like every file, you need to have a way to run scripts that only run at compile time and then generate values that can be used everywhere else. And so I implemented that in order to do index pages, and then realized, well, hey, if I'm generating these values based on data that only exists at compile time, I could do it based on any file that was existing here. And this Git repository is just a file that's sitting here. And so I could parse through it. I think initially I wanted to parse through it and look for commits that were related to like tasks or to-dos and kind of like turn those commits into documentation or something like that. And then that required a bit more parsing and work than I kind of knew how to do at that stage. And so scoped it down to doing just words or something like that.
What's interesting here, Jared, is that if you scroll up there, it almost looks like you're dealing with books now or annotations. So it seems like you've gone from the blog post note style to actually coming up with different types of posts and things like that. Can you go into that now, or is that further?
Yeah, no, totally. So kind of what motivated me there. There's an excited commit over here, if you look, which I should
just have an exclamation
point? It does have an exclamation. I should just filter this log for every commit that has an exclamation mark in it, and that'll be like all the stuff I'm most excited to talk about. But this basically just adds these little annotation components into every. So I started taking notes on books just because I was reading books and I wanted to put more stuff on my website. And then I bought a Kobo e-reader with kind of like the express intention of getting my data off of it. I was reading a lot on a Kindle. I've been like a big fan of Kindles and ebooks for ages, but I was extremely frustrated that I couldn't mess with it in any shape or form because it's extremely locked down. And so I read up a bit. Turns out Kobos have just a SQLite database, and it's totally open. If you plug your Kobo in, you can kind of run whatever queries you want against that. And so I wrote a little script. Let me see if I can find it in here. Yeah, this little load annotation script, which just runs this single query to take the volume ID, which is kind of the name of the book, the text, and the actual annotation I added from Kobo stores it in the bookmarks table, and then dump that all into a JSON file. And then in every page for the books I was reading, I could just pass in the ID for that book, and I'd have, let's see where to go. I'd have the kind of all my annotations pulled in and kind of rendered out relatively nicely. And I could write a little component to do that. Let's see. Oh, I guess this is still on the old. It hasn't checked out all the files. Yeah. And so that was kind of, I, again, didn't really have a notion of what I was going to do with the annotations, but it was the fact that I couldn't do it with the Kindle really bothered me. And then the fact that I could implement it so quickly was, I think, very fun. That was the kind of biggest thing for me for using Next.js. It was like JavaScript became the language that I could write most fluently in to quickly do these ideas. And so then it was like, well, I should basically just have a static site generator in the language because I want to be able to kind of like fluidly try out these ideas. Yeah. Let's see.
Sure. So like timeline wise, like you're talking about the ideas that you were thinking and then implementing, like what was the next big next step, I suppose, like in thinking like, oh, I want to try this on my website and now let's try it.
So I think the big kind of evolution went from vanilla org mode using this bash script to org plus Babel to vanilla JavaScript, which was in some ways kind of a step backwards because it was just a very static site. And then slowly introducing these more dynamic elements, first with the media annotations and then the Git functionality. And then eventually I kind of experimented with more features. I tried out this fuzzy search thing at one point. Let me see if I can check out that commit.
Yeah, what's the fuzzy and fuzzy search? That's what I'm curious about.
Basically, it doesn't have to be perfect. Like perfect search would be something like if I'm searching for the word duck and I switch the C and the U, it wouldn't turn up. Fuzzy search does like the distance between words. And so if anything is within a particular threshold, it'll work out there. And so this had basically just like let's see, somewhere in here, there's just like a thing called fuzzy. Yeah, I'm not sure where it is. Oh, it's probably in its index. No. Yeah. Anyway, it kind of just used a JavaScript library. I have no idea. I guess at this point, I also was experimenting with doing like an API for comments, where commenting has been for a long time a thing I never really figured out on the site. And this basically had it use the just use a library called NodeMailer to connect to my mail server and send me an email whenever someone hit a comment on that. It didn't even use like Mailgun or anything because I figured no one would be sending me enough messages to warrant having to do an actual site here. Interesting. That's, I guess this commit's either just broken or something else.
So would the comment render on the site as well, or would it just be something that you just send a comment and say, okay, well, Jared will email you back soon?
Well, it'll be email me back, and then the premise would be that I could just add the comment to the website. I think Joel talked about something similar, right? Where you can just have that kind of moderation and engage with it a little bit. I don't know if I ever got a comment from that. So it kind of was, but it was a very fun thing to implement. I definitely learned a lot about doing email in JavaScript from it. Yeah. Where did I come in here to look for the first time? Oh yeah, I think this is a fairly representative of what I was trying to do with the folder structure. If you look here on the right, I had this separation in my mind between like essays, which were longer term things I wanted to write, and notes, which were just kind of like this mess of notes sorted into this folder structure. The folder structure kind of made no sense and made it very hard to find things, but it was kind of this whole, that was the dichotomy. And then I had extra stuff like the media things I was writing about, which were just like loose notes on the stuff I was reading, kind of not even full sentences. Yeah. Did that build at all? No, that's just broken. Let me see if I can check out the commit ahead of it. Oh, I kind of keep getting distracted by stuff here, but adding the exclamation marks was a great idea because there's this commit here where I add back org mode files into my site by using a JavaScript. Let me see if I can, where's the script here? The org loader script. So in the JavaScript ecosystem, there's this project called Unified, which is basically a whole set of parsers and AST manipulators for various languages that all speak a kind of standard intermediate language. So it's very similar to Pandoc in that sense, where Pandoc has these kind of inputs and outputs, and it has the Pandoc AST format. And so Unified has a very similar thing, but in JavaScript land. And so I have this very janky pipeline here that parses a file, uses the org rehype parser to turn it into HTML, org mode to HTML, then uses the rehype remark parser to do HTML to markdown, and then stringifies the whole thing, puts it in the folder, which then gets turned from markdown to a JSX file, which gets parsed through as a React component that then gets rendered as React to the website. Which is absolutely terrible now that I say it out loud. And just kind of like thinking about the wasted cycles that goes through that whole thing is just a little saddening. But it kind of worked for a long time. I worked past tense largely because eventually I found out that code blocks of a particular style were causing the whole thing to fail to render because it was being converted into JavaScript code. If one page was not valid JavaScript code, it kind of breaks a chunk of that page would just fail to work. And so I kind of ditched the whole org mode thing. Yeah, that was, I think this stands as like the jankiest thing I did for this website, probably overall. Yeah, most of these things here are just adding individual notes. I don't know if anyone else, I always have in the back of my head this idea of like using Git a little bit more intentionally to chart history, maybe like, parsing it and having keywords in commits to be able to pull out like, oh, this was just a, content commit, but this was a code commit or a big deal commit of some way. Exclamation mark seems to be working kind of fine, but was a little bit iffy.
I do see the sad face where you removed the org files.
Yeah.
A sad day.
How long was it between those two? I think it looks like 2 months. Yeah, allow org files at 8 months ago, and then 6 months ago, remove org files with the sad face.
And you could tell it was hard. I mean, was there a hesitancy to even remove them entirely? If you're just like, oh, I'll just remove that little part that refuses it to render, and I'm just going to keep org mode going in org files.
I think there's this little bit of stubbornness of I don't want to change my notes because my static site generator doesn't want to work with them. So I think I just removed all the org files, put them in a different folder, and then kind of stopped the website from doing it. And so I still elsewhere on my site have, or in my thing, I have a big folder full of org notes here.
It's like the website equivalent of putting something in like the attic, like just put a box there.
Yeah.
Like, don't worry, it's still there. It's still
exactly
in the background.
Yeah. Over here is the commit where I first started doing these website chats with the Brendan as the first one, which was just me and Brendan chatting about it, which we should do again at some time now that more people come to these. Yeah, I'm going to just, I'm going to skip ahead and go to the latest version of this.
Yeah, go right ahead. Does anybody have any questions before Jared goes forward in time to the present?
Ooh, what is on-track workflows? Oh. Cool. And now let's reinstall everything and get it working again.
So yeah, one question you might address later, but just that I'm curious about, kind of looking at how this static site generator, whatever, creates the kind of files and hierarchy of everything. Like, I think you've talked about it in the past about trying to figure out kind of taxonomies and different content structures, and I'm wondering, it looks like it's kind of all been like folder based, but have you added different types of like tagging or other sort of metadata type approaches to organizing stuff as well?
Yeah, so this is kind of like the, not necessarily limitation, but the framework of Next.js is that everything inside the pages directory gets rendered as a single route. So its routing system is just like file system based and folders. And then you can have routes on top of that that remap things, but at a base level, you're dealing with files and folders, which I think is kind of it's one of its biggest drawbacks. And it kind of speaks to how it wasn't initially meant to be used for blogs. It was initially meant for kind of like these single page or, JavaScript app type things. And that was a big limitation for a while, except if you'll notice there's this little tag folder in here now. And so in the latest version of this, I have no idea why all of these seem to be broken, but Next.js added this ability to basically do what I was doing earlier with the compile time processing of generating specific things. It kind of added a very nice API to do that, which is kind of the MO of the Next team. And so I experimented with tags this time in kind of like the latest taxonomy, where everything can have a couple tags, and then this results in, this page kind of isn't live on the site yet, if I recall. But I can kind of, so if you go to the /tags page, it kind of just has a list of all the tags, and then go through to do a particular post, a list of all the posts in there, and it doesn't quite, let's see if I need to find something that has multiple tags on it, which I guess nothing does at this point. That's broken for some reason. But basically the idea was you could have these queries of multiple tags that you add over here. So if you do static slice / computation in the URL / whatever, you can just kind of add tags to the query, and Next.js lets you parse out your URL strings and kind of generate static pages on demand from it, which is the approach I was taking. I've never really had success with tags in anything I've done. I've never managed to tag my music successfully or tag books anywhere. And so, yeah, I don't know if it's just a question of my approach to these things or what, but.
So you're saying it's not so much the technical side of establishing tags in your website, it's just a matter of actually going through and using them.
Yeah, and it's not a, like,
always the hardest part.
It is, right?
100%. Yeah, it's like, I think it's it's a question of, I don't know, I don't have enough trust in the tagging process to assume that some kind of order will emerge, and so I don't tag, and so some order never emerges, and so it's a classic self-fulfilling prophecy there. But yeah, in the latest version of the site, I'm trying to go with this like separation between things I write quickly and things I write over time, this fast and slow hierarchy or ontology, where there's both of them are edited and kind of work with, but the idea is the fast is kind of more temporal stuff, things that are particularly linked to a specific point in time. When we were doing the blogging infrastructure log chain, that was like a particular thing for like a fast post where it was this particular moment in time where people were blogging about this thing and I wanted to be in the blockchain. And so it was a post to respond to that. But then things like this, the personal website tours are a kind of slower piece, that is growing over time and accumulating content. And yeah.
I like it because it actually adds a little more nuance to your original taxonomy, which was just essays and notes. Because even some of the slow thing or some of the fast things could still be considered, I suppose you would call them essays. But at the same time, even some of your slow, methodical, I guess, posts could still be considered notes because you're just constantly adding to them like you would a note. So
like this file is basically just like pieces, like thoughts, sentence fragments, words, and then things in the fast lane. Like this is very much the Hyperlink Academy retro is very much more of like a essay type reasoned writing. I think that the notes, basically notes as a organizing principle didn't make sense because notes kind of connected to everything I was doing and were kind of different things. And so I ended up moving almost all my notes out of the site. And since I've moved them out of the site, I kind of very rarely interact with them and have switched almost solely to handwritten notes. So I don't know, take for that for what you will.
Did you have any other taxonomies in mind besides fast and slow?
I mean, I had the broad separation in mind. I tried out different words for it. There was, like short and long, like through time, this idea of long content, which I think Gordon talks about in his like long blogging kind of thing. Long site and long content. This latest rewrite of my site was motivated largely because of I wanted to move away from JSX because nothing but JSX and the MDX ecosystem could parse it well, and I wanted things that could survive whatever future transition I do with minimal refactoring. And so I was changing kind of all the posts to use just like YAML headers instead of the janky metadata headers that MDX required. With this idea that like, if I can set this up to be the minimally opinionated system, I can make these kind of changes over time and they can accumulate. Because I guess as you've seen, I've thrown away a lot of stuff over time with the site. And while each version has been interesting enough that I feel pretty okay with that, I want to move away from throwing stuff away, and especially throwing content away. I think seeing your site, Joel, the other day, I think was really inspiring in that regard, where just like the things you can do when you have that content over time and the different ways you can put lenses on them and all that kind of thing was really interesting to think about. Yeah,
it almost seems like you're trying to make it so that it can just go with any web framework that you could.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
whenever you're going to transition to that, this content could travel over there instead of, like you said, just throwing it off into a folder somewhere never to be seen on your website.
That's the nice thing about like Markdown, right? Where it's just like there's, in almost any programming language I want to work with, there will be a Markdown parser. In almost any like server, there's probably something in there that I can either hack together a Markdown parser with or already exists. It's the like classic worse is better programming stuff where it has just enough things that it's going to exist and it's going to keep going and people are going to work with it, but it's kind of limited. I can definitely see the appeal of Paul.
About WordPress.
Yeah, very, very WordPress. Is Markdown the like WordPress of static sites? That's an interesting kind of model there. But yeah, so I guess that's definitely the philosophy. I don't think my experiments are going to stop anytime soon, so I need to implement things to make them a little less painful for me in terms of keeping things around. Yeah, I think that kind of covers everything interesting I did with it over time.
Got it. Talking about experiments and maybe like towards the future, is there anything that you want to like work on, or things that you are working on now that you want to implement into the site?
Well, so one thing I want to be able to do is kind of, so take for example, backlinks, right? I could not necessarily easily, but fairly achievably write a little piece of JavaScript that parses through every other post on the site for a particular page and looks for links back to it. But what I want to be able to do is write that JavaScript in such a way that I could have it running in my editor or in a terminal somewhere, and also use it to generate the final version of the site. So it can exist both as like a piece of rendered output visually and as a tool that I can use to think about things while writing. Conceptually, that should be possible. It's probably going to take some hacking to pull it off, but that's kind of like the next major evolution of this is this convergence of editing environment and publishing environment for me, where I can have things that publish out that are also things that influence how I'm writing, whatever I'm writing. The big one is like, for some of the longer things I'm like the things that go in the slow content bucket, right? Like the personal website tours, like these things, for example, there's definitely stuff I'd like to do in terms of pulling together ideas that emerge through all of these different things that are tasks. And so I would love to be able to like drop in here just like a header that's like task, pull out couple blogging ideologies or something, right? And just have that as a thing that both publishes out as a public task, but then also like renders out to a task list that I can work with on my day-to-day basis. And I can pull together, like if I have these scattered through all the slow things I'm writing, right? Or even maybe some of the fast things, if it's like, update this in 6 months or whatever, and have that kind of just embedded in there, and then have a little program that informs what I write about on a given day. That I think would be really cool.
And what do you mean like publish out the task, or like, I guess I could only imagine that could also mean that somebody can not only see the task, but then also maybe make a pull request or something, say, hey, I found some ideology, blogging ideologies, and then you could just
totally, and just plug that right in. Or I mean, ideally, because we're dealing with just JavaScript and client-side stuff here, there could even be, I could render this thing out as a, whenever it sees a task, there could be a little button to like give input to that task that just adds it directly to the page or whatever. Making use of, the way I'm currently doing this is I've got lists of issues here, and these are just connected to the GitLab. The issues on GitLab, and that's kind of how I'm trying to pull it together currently, using it as kind of an intermediate, because the advantage here is that I can reference these issues inside commits, and Git will kind of, the GitLab thing will process it, close the issues, open issues, do whatever. And so I can have a little bit of the things I'm doing, the tasks, be connected to the actual writing in the commit. And it kind of worked out, kind of not. It's kind of pushing towards this longer term Git view where the Git log becomes a more meaningful artifact. But looking at my Git log now, I might have to do some intense rebasing if I want that to be the case. Yeah.
Have you tried playing around with the GitLab API to like bring in some of these tasks into your website or anything like that?
I have not. That's definitely something I'd be interested in doing. I know their API is pretty accessible, but I don't know. I'd rather put my efforts into trying to get the tasks onto the website, the content itself, than writing the glue code to put together the kind of 3-editor website GitLab thing. I don't know. Maybe that does seem like a more viable short-term approach. So maybe I should think about that. Yeah. I don't know. Git as a tool for charting long-term projects, I think is, especially long-term writing, is underexplored, at least to me. And that's something I want to dig into more. Yeah. Cool. Are
I
there...
think we're cool. Yeah. I mean, I think we want to maybe open it up to some questions. That's okay with you, Jared?
Yeah. I mean, if anyone has anything, shoot. Cool.
I just had a quick question about how your personal site kind of ties in with the other websites that you are building now and in the future.
Oh, yeah.
So like Hyperlink Academy or Fathom or whatnot, like, is it important to you that they all kind of have the same underlying infrastructure as far as like hosting and build flows and all that sort of stuff?
I mean, it's not something I explicitly set out to do, but it is kind of did happen that way, where I'll kind of have an idea of something, try it out on one of the various sites I'm building at a particular point in time, and it'll trickle down to the other. In the case of the Pandoc script, I think I started that on my personal website, and then the Fathom site started using the Pandoc build script for a while, and then I switched that over to Next on the Fathom site, and then switched my personal website over to Next. And then since then, the personal website's kind of turned into the staging area for various new technologies. So the CSS and JavaScript stuff I tried out here for the first time. Whenever Next does like a version upgrade, I'll try it out on my personal website for the first time. And having it be this kind of technology experimentation zone is really useful. I worry about getting too tied to a particular tool where I'm kind of trying to use it all for everything, but thus far the stack has been flowing pretty nicely. I think the Fathom site is still hosted on Netlify, but everything else I have is hosted on Zeit, which is, they're both extremely similar in terms of how they function, but Zeit is a little more hacky / developer oriented, and Next is a little bit more static site oriented. But they're, yeah, both, that's all kind of I'm using to host anything right now. And they both have kind of plugins into deployment things. So whenever I push a commit to Git, it'll pull the code, run the build script, push up the deployed artifact, which is very slick. I was, for a while, doing something jankier with like rsyncing, running the script locally and then rsyncing the whole thing to a server, which worked fine in all honesty. But when I started doing the JavaScript stuff, it just became a little bit easier to plug into these things which exist. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first one, do you have any other guiding star websites for like what you aspire your own personal website to be? And then two, are there any other web frameworks that you're looking into? Just after hearing your comments saying that you don't want to rely on one technology or one stack, I'm assuming maybe you have roving eyes onto other.
I mean, so kind of, I think the next evolution I might do is writing my own static site generating framework, or not framework, but tool in JavaScript. Really, the stuff that I'm doing is not that complicated, in that a lot of the work that goes into Next is enabling this kind of hybrid server-side thing that is really, is very nice as a developer experience for me on my tiny site, but isn't necessary. And so if I ditch that, loosen some assumptions, I should be able to build a thing from scratch in vanilla JavaScript or TypeScript that lets me do what I think. And that's what I think would be most interesting in terms of moving away from constraints or being stuck to particular tools. In framework land, I mean, there are a lot of JavaScript frameworks. I am pretty tied to the React ecosystem at this point, but there's Gatsby.js. I've been really interested in Elm for a while, and just the kind of programming it espouses. I think they have they're really more an app builder than a static site builder, but it's a really interesting technology. So there are a couple things. In terms of like guiding star websites, Gorin is 100% up there. Fascinating site. I think kind of everyone here is plugged into that. Andy Matushak's thing, definitely there as well. And Kix Condor's site probably is one I turn to whenever I need inspiration. Yeah, those are the ones that come to mind, but I'm sure there's more. Yeah. Cool. Maybe I'll stop sharing at this point, and I'll stop the recording.